Grimdark and Dark Fantasy Games. Live Games Crit from Design Professor. Now I have to always caveat when I call myself a professor. In America, that basically means anyone who teaches at college level is a professor. I'm definitely a professor in the American sense, because I've taught in a couple of different universities, but I'm not a professor in the British sense. To get a professorship in a British university, you have to work there for a long time, and then you have to do things that management like, I don't know, not be in the union and things like that. Good morning, everyone. Very strange MIDI acoustic guitar here. She moves nice. Bit of a floaty jump. Was I supposed to immediately go out there? If you're seeing this and it's quite blurry and feels a bit slow, this doesn't feel very optimized for what the game is. But that's with all of those blurring effects turned off. It's a bit too bright now, which is a shame because like the color of the game was quite good on the high settings, but all of the blur and everything made it feel really sluggish. It still feels quite sluggish. Let's just go through what I can do. We've got a kind of combat Metroidvania, like a kind of classic Castlevania type one. I've got a knife. It's going to feel a bit like I'm going straight into laying into this game. And I want to just make sure we go straight to, you know, candidly addressing the problems with this game. If the first half of that animation was a little bit faster, that would feel aggressive and dangerous. But it feels a bit more like she's poking something with the knife, like trying to pop a balloon or like scrape something off a wall. It's a little bit sluggish. And then in terms of visual design, you've got a purple character on a purple background, right? And this is a problem that comes from sort of maybe wanting to make things match. And, you know, the UI stands out. We've got a lot of colours in the UI that stand out from the general kind of purpleness. I think having a little bit of differentiation between the main character and the background would be helpful. One of the things you will notice in a lot of these sort of action-based games, whether they're roguelikes or Metroidvanias or whatever, is they start you in an area where there's a high contrast color between the character and the background. So in Hades, you're a red and black character on a green background. And that means you can learn the game by seeing what you can do. Later on, it doesn't matter if they put you on a red background, because by then you can tell how everything in the game works. But starting with a purple character and a purple background is a bit of a problem. Vivian, come forth. We have a task for you, Darkest One. Reports have reached us of a gaping chasm within the chapel in the east. Rumor has it that it conceals a necromancer's lair. A dungeon of the undead. I shall delve into its depths and uncover its secrets. Very zoomed in when we're in these kind of dialogue sections. The bow feels quite nice to use. I quite like the jumping bow, particularly. Feels like it should have some directionality. Like if you look at the way that the bow is implemented on Rogue Legacy, being able to aim the bow in different directions, that's cool. Very good. Should be able to do that while jumping as well, like jump, hang in the air for a second, shoot downwards kind of thing. And then a lot of this UI text is not, it kind of doesn't feel like it fits in the game. And I'm not saying go for a totally illegible sort of horrible medieval font, but this looks like a kind of Sega arcade game from 2005. So I think you need to just a bit more of a way of doing typography that feels like it fits in the world, you know? And then about the music, as far as I can tell, these are actual sort of guitar concertos, like existing classical music guitar concertos. I think the problem with doing that in a fantasy setting is that is a kind of historical piece of music that makes people think of the real world, right? Whereas this is a fantasy world. I don't know whether other people will find it strange. I kind of get what they're going for, because it's kind of that Diablo thing of using kind of moody Spanish guitar with dark fantasy. So it's not a bad choice overall. It's just having those very kind of recognizable concertos feels a bit strange in this setting. So that's with the graphics on medium. I personally find all of this blur, particularly with the camera tracking you, I find a lot of this blur a little bit much. That primary attack is just so sluggish. I think some of this probably comes from like using a pack of animations that are designed for another sort of game, you know. That's the kind of animation you can get away with in like an MMO where the camera's zoomed out and we're not paying a very high amount of attention to the character. But in something like this, it's like a single character driven action game. The animation is just way too sluggish for this type of thing. There we go. Right, I just got an upgrade that gives me a quick blade. Again, yeah, just the visual contrast. White and purple on white and purple. I'd much rather have the camera much more zoomed out and the camera moving less. And I think some of this comes down to genre research. Because I can't think of a game in this genre where the camera sort of tracks you one-to-one like that. It just feels, again, like one of these passion projects where the developer has made a lot of content before really refining the base activity that you're doing. When you see people who've made lots and lots of games develop a game, and if they were going to kind of develop something like this, you would have a lot of kind of prototyping of the combat in a grey box to get all of these things right. Oh, that's only got collision from one side. Yeah, we've got like a Mario kind of, you can jump through platforms thing. Again, if we pull the camera back and it's a little bit more cartoony and abstract, we can justify jumping through a platform like that. Because when you see a regular old school platformer and someone jumps through a platform, you sort of assume they're jumping in front of it or behind it. But because we're so close up and everything is such high-res 3D graphics, when I jump through a platform, it literally looks like I'm phasing through a solid 3D object, and that feels bad, right? I do like that this dungeon feels like a sort of lived-in place that's been taken over. Yeah, Stanley Rose in the chat said a room-based camera would be better, and I wouldn't say it's kind of making me feel sick or anything like that, but it sort of means that you can't really plan how you're going to move around a room, right? If you play something like a Castlevania or Rogue Legacy or something like that, you can usually see the whole room unless it's a very big room. And that means if you're kind of fighting 3 enemies in a tight space, you can sort of see all the areas you can jump out to, and if there's anything you can bounce off of and all of that kind of stuff, and you can plan it as you go. But if the camera is constantly moving, it sort of damages your spatial awareness of the room you're fighting in. It doesn't feel like a decision that's been made with thought towards what games in the genre usually do, and it doesn't feel like a decision that's been made to like enhance the core thing of what we're supposed to be getting out of the game, which I think is to feel like a cool ninja, right? What is the kind of design pillar of this? What is the thing we're trying to make someone experience? It's being a cool, fast character that's really dangerous and deadly. And every time you do something that gets in the way of the player feeling like they can do cool stuff, you're damaging that kind of design pillar. I do like the bow though. I think the bow feels pretty good for a platformer bow, but I do want to be able to aim it in the air. And again, I think a lot of this just comes down to genre research. Games that do this kind of combat in a platformer, even just playing the demos of them and seeing how they map the controls, seeing how things feel. Because when people play games, they're sort of using the language that they've got from all the games they've played so far, of how these games control and how they work and stuff. And if you're making sort of seemingly random design decisions that don't speak the same language as the player, and you can't really justify besides, oh, I wanted the camera to move that way, or I wanted that attack to work that way. It's a tough sell. You know, you've got some real love and care that's gone into these illustrations and the kind of 3D assets in the game. I don't know how much of that game comes from asset packs, but it is quite consistent, right? But yeah, it's kind of that very high gloss 3D art makes the issues with the user interface and the typography stand out even more, I think. There's a big oogly boogly in some sort of shield. Okay, so this is a boss. I think we have to go around the dungeon and power up and then decide when to fight the boss. I like the way these guys kind of jib into lots of little bits. That's fun. Sword attack, again, kind of feels a little bit weak. Cool enemy designs, though. Look, we can see this guy's got these horns, so he's going to act like a bull, charge us. Again, contrast between the colours used in the character palettes and the backgrounds could be a bit higher here. Right, so if you're going to use these kind of muted, desaturated greys, pick a place to use them. So if we're going to have grey in our dude and our enemies, then make all of the greys in the background not actually grey. Make them like green or blue or purple or something. If you look at a lot of really successful dungeon run games, that's what they do, right? They sort of differentiate between the characters in the background so that it doesn't all blend together. I really like the enemy variety that we're getting shown straight away. It's already showing me that I'm going to need to sort of learn the behaviors of these different enemies. You know, the red one runs at you, the big kind of yellow Minotaur thing has a big spinning attack that it doesn't do very often, but when it does, you need to stay away from it entirely. There's a lot of enemy behavior to learn here, right? If we compare it to the last game, I could sort of, in the last game, I could kind of look at the enemies and go, oh, that's a flying enemy, that's a walking enemy, that's a ranged enemy. But there wasn't as much going on as there is here in terms of really needing to understand how each one moved. I'm so used to dash being on the sort of circle position on most controllers. If it's not there, I forget I've got it. Yeah, I'm not sure about mapping things onto combinations of triggers, like having to press 2 triggers at the same time. So, in terms of the camera movement on this one, I'm not finding the movement of the camera troublesome so much, but I do, again, think it's a little bit close in. And I expect this is something that the developer has already kind of experimented with a fair amount, because you sort of have to in a game like this. I would generally think about where the character is looking and sort of bias the camera over that way a little bit. That is actually what it's doing. If we look here, if I turn in 4 directions, the camera is sort of drifting towards where the character is facing, which I think is what I would want. But yeah, I'm really enjoying this game in terms of content variations. Like, every weapon I've picked up feels very different to use. It feels like it's a different thing to kind of learn and master. The enemies are different from each other in really fun ways. I think there are some camera issues that can only be solved through experimentation, but I do think we're a little bit too zoomed in again. And I just think, you know, part of the issue with this kind of theme, of this grimdark kind of theme and how it plays into the art style, is we've just got a lot of grey on grey. I would just think about, you know, trying to create a little bit more colour contrast between characters in the environment, because like if you look at that ballista over there at the moment, is almost invisible, and that means that when there's quite a few enemies on the screen, if there's one like that that's in a big pile of gore, maybe the gore needs to fade a little bit after it's hit the ground as well, because that visual noise created by all that gore is really satisfying to sort of paint the level with your enemies' entrails. I'm a big fan of that. But if you look at the enemies on it, once they're walking across it, they become quite illegible. And some of that is just that we have very dark, low contrast enemy designs. So there are a bunch of ways you can resolve that. One is to make the internal contrast of the characters higher, right? We already have that distinction a little bit, because if you look at the textures on the ground, the tiles on the floor don't have hard black outlines, right? Which is kind of as it should be. We've got like a low contrast on the background so that it doesn't mess with the characters too much. But I think the internal contrast in the characters could be higher, and I think we can contrast the characters in the background a bit more by kind of making the background have a sort of key color to it. Hi, I'm just sort of chipping in later on after I've recorded this video to sort of show you what I mean about this kind of creating contrast through color. I think this game is already pretty good, and it sort of has a lot of clear visual rules to do with how it uses outlines and stuff, but if I wanted to make this game a lot easier to understand, I would give the color palettes of the characters and the backgrounds a slightly different character to them. And I'm gonna just kind of do that now and then fast forward through this so you can see what I'm doing. I'm just chopping all of these different elements out on GIMP, which is like Photoshop, so I can kind of show you how more kind of visible different elements of the game will be if we put them in slightly different color palettes from each other. Here I've taken all of the floor tiles and I've shifted everything towards green a little bit. You can already see how if the floor has a slightly different color tint from these wall areas, then everything is kind of a bit easier to read than it was in the original version. These enemies now stand out more because we have a red enemy and enemies with kind of red elements in them on a kind of green background palette, which creates contrast, right? And even this guy down here, who was kind of quite invisible before, is now easier to see. There, if I revert that change, he kind of stands out a lot more because he's a different set of colors from the thing that he's on. We can kind of take that further. We can take these characters that are on this layer, do something with their contrast so that they're much higher contrast, right? Because one of the ways that you make an element stand out is to give it higher internal contrast, which means with itself, right? So it means that if you've got different shades of grey on a character, and that character is supposed to be important, you make the contrast between those shades of grey more extreme, and then it stands out as a more important object in the information hierarchy than like these kind of tiles on the floor, which they've already kind of made washed out so we don't pay as much attention to them. Right? This is what it looked like before. The grey is slightly blue, but the temperature of the colours is the same between the ground and the characters, and that makes it all harder to read. The specific color change I've made here isn't really the point. The point isn't that you should make the ground green. You can make the ground slightly purple or whatever makes everything else show up. But by having a slightly higher color contrast between the background and the characters just become more legible. And then also if we kind of transfer this thinking to the walls as well, it's then much easier to see the distinction between this wall and the ground. And that's important because, you know, knowing where the walls are is gameplay important information, right? So this isn't the only way of achieving this, but one of the benefits of working in 2D is you are not dealing with 3D lighting where, you know, the colored lighting in a 3D environment washes everything out like you're on a film set and makes everything the same color and makes it hard to do this kind of color theory. When you're doing all of your art from scratch in 2D, you have total control over everything. So make use of that and use the kind of stuff I'm talking about here. It doesn't have to be this exact approach of turning this grey thing to green or turning this grey thing to red, but thinking about the relative contrast between things in terms of how much colour they have in them and how contrasted the shades are with that object. I think the developer here has already thought about this. You can see that thinking in the background tiles. I think they just need to go a little bit of a step further so that we don't get that problem with, like, when an enemy is walking over one of these messy, gory areas, you can't really see them and they kind of blend in. Yeah, the behavior variation of the enemies is great. And I think just the overall tone of it, it's like, kind of reminds me of Quake or something. Seems very committed to not doing standard fantasy and not doing standard, like, angels and demons or anything like that. It's a very strange set of kind of monsters and, oh. I like the kind of world building that's going on here, even though it's very minimal and there's not much story being told, but the sense of the kind of general vibe of the creatures and the weaponry and everything is doing a lot in terms of just sort of this passive storytelling about what kind of world this is. I think most of the things that could be done to improve this game are like ramping up certain sound effects. Like when I die, it doesn't feel like there's a big sort of anti-celebration of dying, right? And stuff like that. And then just making the game more like visually clear. Valkyrie Rosetta is a game I think I'm possibly not going to like. And I just want to say that up front because it's nice when you get pleasantly surprised by something. You can already see from the way that this is designed, like the graphic design of this front thing, that it's going for sort of old school Final Fantasy, right? I can also see it's going to be sort of turn-based JRPG style combat from the 90s. Historically, I have not liked these games, and that is mainly because the combat in 90s JRPGs like Pokemon and sort of the older Final Fantasies, it's often there just to sort of justify the grind in the background of the game. You're not making very interesting make or break decisions in the combat as you take turns attacking something. You're just kind of whittling it down. I've been using RPG Maker since I was a teenager. I really like RPG Maker engines, but whenever I try and make anything in it, I am usually totally avoiding that battle system because I don't like it. I don't think it does anything that kind of encourages people to have to think particularly tactically or anything like that. So I already have a very strong bias against this type of game, and that means that if the kind of art and the world don't particularly grab me, then we're going to be a bit stuck here. I stand alone, 100 enemies before me, and I realize it doesn't matter if you're strong. In war, you are always just a pawn. That's a slightly goofy feeling walk animation with the kind of leaning forward. Feels a little bit like a rhino charging. But as an overall image, like all of this kind of glow and everything is very, very moody and cool and dreamlike. So sort of already seeing some kind of strengths and weaknesses here in terms of art. This dead soldier, I can feel something from him. Did you speak to my mind? You have mistaken, I'm not a Valkyrie. I think when the soldier talks, then the main character's portrait needs to go away, right? Because in this kind of visual novel UX, when there's a character there, we expect the character to be the named character that is speaking. So I know you don't want to do a portrait for the soldier because he's not a primary character and that would be too much work. I get that, but that means when he's speaking, she needs to go away. I can feel my soul slowly fading. I beg you, take me. Take me with your horn. You really are a Valkyrie. I am Bran. I said I'm not a Valkyrie. Is a Valkyrie simply born without knowing she is one? I think if you want to show them both, then you darken the one who's not speaking, you shrink them down a little bit, and then the one who's speaking gets kind of this level of brightness. So it sort of like goes between the two characters, and they kind of get lighter and darker and move forward and back slightly. Maybe you are, or you are not. What matters is that we are still here. I think this walk animation feels very strange, and I think it really depends how charitable the person playing it is being. I'm only being uncharitable about it and criticizing it because I know other people will be more mean about it and say, look at that kind of silly walk. Like the way the legs are moving makes it feel like a run, but the arms aren't moving to match it as a run. And I think if you had the proper arm movement like a jog, then it would read fine. But sort of running with your head forward and your arms down by your side sort of looks like she's trying to poke someone with the horn on a helmet, you know? It is the Naruto run, you're right. For tutorial, pause game and see battle manual. Asking me to go and read a manual sort of makes the assumption that I care, and I don't at this stage. Attack mode. Items. These have controller mapping, so am I supposed to be playing this with the controller? Oh, I see. Okay, so when they attack, you press the character's relative buttons to decide whether they defend or not. And then you just hammer the buttons to make them attack. The thing is, I couldn't do much better than this in terms of animation, but that's why when I do make games, I don't make games where I'm required to make a high-quality character walk around. We're already into grinding. We've done 5 minutes and we're already in this kind of state of defeat the same enemy a bunch of times, and this is just bringing me back to why I don't like classic JRPGs. You know, I liked them when I was a kid, I liked the story, I liked the going around and getting loot, but as I've got older, this kind of model of grinding the same thing by doing a form of combat that doesn't feel particularly fun while you're doing it. And I will be charitable this time and look at the manual, but that really needs to be baked in. I can't get to the combat manual here. I think I can only get to the combat manual when I'm in combat, but I couldn't find the button to do that. During attack mode, the player can execute 3 types of attack and use items: basic, skill, burst, item use. Basic attacks are triggered by pressing the corresponding button for each character in the party formation. So each character in the party has a button, and then to do a skill attack, you hold LB and then do that button. Burst points are gathered in various scenarios during battle. The player can strategize. Yeah, blah, 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 blah. I would say every individual part of what we can see here looks really beautiful. You know, I've already made my jabs about the walk animation, but if we look at this kind of relatively still with the idle animation, I would say that this looks gorgeous. The parallax layers and sort of how handcrafted everything looks. I think the falling black dust maybe needs to go at the same frame rate as the other stuff. If it had a stutter in that effect, so it only moved every 3 times a second or whatever, then everything would feel more cohesive. But the individual parts are all really, really appealing. There's just something about them that's slightly mismatched in places. What I don't like is the kind of metagame structure of we are just walking in a straight line fighting a dude over and over again. Which is what happens when you have JRPG combat because it's built around that structure. It feels like that challenge tower mode that you would get. Right, that's cool, right? I'm not really getting a chance to need to use these more advanced techniques yet, and I think I would like that a bit sooner. Give me like 2 basic enemies before I get something that I need to actually use a challenge attack on, because it just felt like a little bit too grindy there with how many basic ghouls we got in a row. So the combat is basically button bashing, but you sort of... there's a lot of kind of stuff where you have to time things right, and where you can choose the flavor of button bashing by kind of holding down an additional button to make them execute special skills. So I don't think I can do that right now because I don't have enough points.
I should have stayed. I'm worried about the children. If I could have another chance, I should have fought bravely.
Thank you, I am available for voiceover work. She looks a bit like Jodie Comer. I think that's who that is. Aww. I believe this is where, if I was a Gen Z, I would say it's giving mother. I want to talk briefly about this writing. I don't think it's terrible, right? I think it suits the genre. It's cheesy, but it's kind of supposed to be cheesy. It's a cheesy genre of game. What I would like is a little bit more context for who Rosetta is. We sort of understand she's a general, but we've sort of jumped straight into this new state of her life where she's not alive, she's a Valkyrie. And she's a little bit shocked by it, and she's in this situation where she like doesn't know what's going on. But we don't really know enough about who she was before because we've started on the battlefield, right? And I think maybe if we were to tutorialize this game's combat system and stuff like that in a bit more of a normal world situation before we get to the battlefield, then we could make the most of the battlefield, because we could make those ghoul combats a little bit more threatening, have a little bit more danger. We're in a scary environment, we're in a very creepy environment with fire and corpses everywhere and stuff like that. And treating that as the tutorial of the game sort of robs us of an opportunity to see what our main character's life is like before they become a Valkyrie. So we're going to go to Ashes of Morgravia. I've actually got it here because I downloaded the itch version, but then I was sent a key for the Steam version, which I think is more up to date. So let's jump into this. Background blur are in the chat today. The Harbinger, you awaken, Godwoken, called forth by whispers that defy the corruption spreading in the eternal night. If you have text like this, if you break it up so that there's less on each of these panels, people will generally have an easier time with it. You know, I make this font maybe 50% bigger and then have half as much text per click. Morgravia crumbles, consumed by the well's hunger, its people lost to despair and the dead that walk among them. But you, Godwoken, you may yet offer the faintest spark of hope. I feel a bit more okay with ragging on this game than the others because Background Blur Studios are in the chat. What we need in this dialogue sequence is this.
Get on with it. Yes, get on with it.
Get on with it. Whenever we're playing a fantasy game with a lore dump, I'm just going to have a macro on my OBS to play the Monty Python "Get on with it" sketch. Arbiter is our kind of warrior class. Bastion is a sort of tank type thing. Pentinent is a sort of holy one. You'll master 2 unique decks: Stride deck for movement and positioning, Clash deck for combat and abilities. Each deck is tied to its respective phase during every round. Okay. And we have a kind of movement grid as well. There's a lot of stuff here in terms of new stuff to learn for people that have played this genre. Click on the card in your hand to view its possible effects and targets. The card's range or area of effect will be highlighted on the battlefield. Choose a target, self-targeting cards, enemy targeting cards, area of effect cards. Okay. Again, I think this is okay for a demo tutorial, but a lot of this stuff should be explanatory when we're using the cards during gameplay. So let's kind of see what happens. So this is me, and I can zoom out, and then we've got this kind of lovely hand-drawn tabletop that looks like a D&D map. Kind of looks like I'm playing Gloomhaven or something like that. And these are my cards. So I've got a movement ability here. So in the first phase where I'm doing movement, I've got cards that give me movement, I've got cards that up my stats, draw cards from the Clash deck and gain faith. And then the only enemy I've got here is looking to block, so I'm just going to stand here and buff myself, I think. Yeah, I want to set him on fire. I think when you click on the card, it feels like it needs some other state to tell you that it's waiting for activation. It's like I click on the card, then I go to click on the guy, but there's like a sort of missing state in the UI. But yeah, I love this idea of doing like a little kind of D&D skirmish combat with cards. That kind of works really well for me. I think there are some steps in the interface that are maybe missing, but they're not big breaking things. What is that? How do I find out about the enemies as well? I'll zoom in on them. He's got 45 health. This one's got 30 health. That one's going to be sniping me from a distance, so I should get up close to it. And can I move around it so I can get on the other side? Is that a thing I can do? In Slay the Spire and similar games, it's like you are always using the same resource to play attacks or blocks, so you're always making this base decision on every turn of whether to prioritize blocking or attacking. But here, the blocking happens in the sort of preparation and movement phase, and then you attack separately, which is an interesting thing. I think it might make it quite difficult to sort of hold your decks of cards in your head and plan them long term, but we'll see. There's a lot of interesting ideas here. So who have we got here? We've got a Spooky Ghost, we've got Choppy Skeleton, and we've got the Evil Butler. Yeah, I think there are just some sort of confirmation stages in this where you're kind of clicking through cards and deciding where to use them, where it's just a little bit confusing and unclear. But I like the game as a whole. I think there's a lot of stuff here to like. I like the theme, I like the sort of grim fantasy stuff. The 2 decks is a cool idea. I would really have to play this for a much longer period of time to see what the long-term ramifications of having the 2 decks is. But I quite like that you have 2 decks that are both used in this combat game. I like the idea of the characters I've seen so far and how they differ from each other. Definitely going to be interested to see how this one develops. I think everyone who submitted their games this time, I sent you invites to our Discord. The way our Discord works is, if your game is on Indies Under the Knife, you get in the Discord. If you support the channel financially, you get in the Discord. It's a fun community, and you can make a thread for the games that you're currently making and post about it there as well, which is quite helpful for getting feedback. Every game this week had some really strong points. I think this grouping them together by a theme worked pretty well. Next time we do this next week, we've got games with weird and wild aesthetics over here. And then we're going to have a kind of puzzle horror thing. Right, I am going to log off and go and try and do something else productive. Thank you all for joining today. I hope you enjoyed this new format.